Hi, my name is Saank, and I run an astrology website called LifeLuckLoveAstrology.com. I'm doing this because a very close friend of mine asked me to read Prince's astrology chart. Prince's music and his message played a big role in her life, and she felt that deeper insight into his personality and life would help her to cope with the loss of one of her favorite artists. So, to honor my friend's request, I put together a 90-minute reading of Prince's astrology chart using a form of sidereal astrology that I've been practicing for over 23 years. Prince's Western astrology chart says that Prince is a Gemini with his moon in the sign of Pisces, and he has a rising sign of Scorpio. But his sidereal chart is very different. Using my system of astrology, I would have been able to tell Prince's parents at a very early age that he would excel in music. If you're a Prince fan, I'm sure you're in for a pleasant experience. And if you're not, it will definitely be interesting to look to see how sidereal astrology differs from Western astrology. Any feedback on my interpretation would be greatly appreciated. You can reach me at Saunk, Saungkh, at lifeluckloveastrology.com, or you can find me on Facebook. Just search for Life, Luck, Love Astrology. So, without further ado, I introduce to you Prince's Sidereal Astrology Chart. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started. We're looking at Prince's birth chart. So, assuming the information is correct that we have, and the accuracy of the information, his birth information, will dictate how accurate Prince's chart is. But we're going to assume that everything is accurate. So, Prince's birth date is June 7th, 1958. His birth time is 6:17 p.m. and his place of birth is Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States of America. So what we're going to do to explain Prince's chart is a few things. The first thing we're going to do in this particular system is we're going to look at his moon sign. The moon sign is the essence of the personality. Unlike in Western astrology that focuses on the sun, this system focuses on the moon. And when you think of the moon, think of the fact that the moon reflects. It's watery in nature. If you pour water into any type of glass, it will take the shape of the glass. So water mimics, water reflects. There's no effort to things that have to do or related to water. And the element that's related to the moon is the water, which is why I'm using water in relation to the moon. So it's that reflective quality. There's no effort that has to be made. You just have these talents and capabilities naturally. And his moon sign, when you look at it, it really makes a lot of sense. I was a little surprised, but it really makes a lot of sense. Now, the next thing that we'll look at in this chart is going to be his sun sign. And the sun is a strong indicator of personality, but it's what you have to work to become. So it's what you become after a lot of effort, after a lot of hard work. Some people never actually fully manifest the sun sign. They're pulled toward it. It influences them, but they're never really manifested. But in this particular case, we can see that that Prince's sun sign is Taurus, which is very interesting. And again, we'll talk about that later on. So the next thing we're going to look at after we look at the moon sign and the sun sign is we're going to look at Prince's planets. And the planets are going to tell you what types of talents that person has and in what areas of life and the challenges or experience that they have in different areas of their life. So that's what we're going to do next. So that's the three ways we're going to look at Prince from a sidereal astrology perspective. We're going to look at his moon sign, we're going to look at his sun sign, and then we're going to look at the planets' positioned houses and look at house placement. So I hope you guys are ready to start. So let's start with the first thing is that Prince's moon sign. So based on the data that we have, what I have on Prince's birth time, his moon is in 8 degrees Aquarius, 47 minutes, and it has a asterism of Rahu. So he would be an Aquarius Rahu. And another tradition that I belong to, they refer to this combination as an or Sir Nekabet. But for our astrological perspective, if you're an astrologer or familiar with astrologer, Prince's moon is going to be in Aquarius. And again, this is sidereally. And the type of Aquarius that he's going to be is going to be a Rahu Aquarius. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because the Rahu doesn't just function by itself. It acts as a psychic energy that reflects another quality into his personality. And it so happens is that the Rahu for Prince, and you'll see it later on when we look at his house positions, the Rahu is deposited in the sign of Libra. So what happens is that he gets the qualities of Libra. So when you look at him, he's an Aquarius slash Libra, or another way to say it, he's an Aquarius slash Venus. So he's a Venusian Aquarius. And then he's not just a regular Venusian Aquarius, he's the Rahu is a psychic energy. So it attracts things to it, it picks up on things. So I'm jumping ahead of myself. So let's explain this piece by piece. So Aquarius. So some of the things that make Aquariuses very interesting is that Aquariuses are outgoing. They're very sociable because it's an air sign. So Aquarius is an air sign, very outgoing, very sociable. Now the planet that governs Aquarius is going to be Saturn, which is very interesting because when you think of Prince, or when I think of Prince, everything about him to me seems Venusian. But this sign of Aquarius, the planet that rules it is Saturn. So it makes these people who are airy, they're sociable, they're outgoing, warm. It kind of takes that airy nature, and the Saturn restricts it. Uh, it changes them to make them, instead of kind of all over the place area, it makes them very structured. It makes them very disciplined. It makes them very hardworking. Now, the interesting thing about the combination between Aquarius, which is an air sign, the air sign of Aquarius, and the Saturn it sits on, is like typically Saturn has rings around it, and the rings constrain and hold things in. But with the Aquarius, it's a little bit different. The rings don't constrain. It's almost like it's breaking away the constraints. And when you look at Prince, you can see that. The Aquariuses tend to be the people that think differently. They don't necessarily agree with the society, and they're going to do things a unique way, their way. Other people are going to tell them, hey, you should do this, this way, but they will rebel against the norms if they don't feel that the structures that exist are right. If they don't see that the structures that exist support mankind and support people, they will break away from those things. They will remove those bounds that restrict and bind and prevent man from realizing the greatest essence of his humanity. So very interesting that he has that Aquarius, because we can see that. The other thing about Aquarius is, which is very interesting, is that they're very intellectual. So because the Saturn makes them able to focus for really long periods of time and study, and pick things up, and gives them lots of discipline. They are people who will typically take a craft and they will master that craft. In fact, one of the interesting things that I've seen from doing the charts of other famous people is that many famous people tend to be Aquariuses, particularly those people who are in movies, particularly those people who are entertainers. A lot of them tend to be Aquariuses, and it is very interesting. When I see that sign, it's someone who has the creativity, has the people skills, but the creativity and people skills doesn't make the person too far out, because that Saturn pulls them down and grounds them and makes them disciplined, where they can go out and they can be successful in their craft. And that's very much the case. Interestingly enough, when you look at this Aquarius as well, one of the things that I've noticed about Aquarius is that they're very outgoing, very warm from the air. They can be very outgoing, very warm, very sociable, but they need the opportunity to remove themselves away from public life and kind of recharge their batteries. The other thing that's really interesting about them, they have this phenomenal speaking skills. They have this phenomenal creativity. They're able to work well in organizations, and they like working with people. But there is a tendency also for them to get into deep depressions. So one of the things that I typically will see with people who are Aquarius is I'll see someone who's really, really outgoing on the outside, but on the inside, they kind of are plagued by feelings of depression, and things aren't going right, and things don't meet their standards. So very interesting. Again, the Aquariuses are uh, they're avant-garde, they're new, they're revolutionary in terms of, oftentimes can be revolutionary in the way they look at things. And when you look at the way Prince approached music, you'd have to admit that he had a pretty revolutionary approach. He was very unique. He wasn't copying anyone. He was expressing what he believed, how things should be relative to sex. He expressed things how he believed they should be relative to music. I heard one uh, interview of Prince where they talked about where he was talking about, it was with Tavis Smiley, and Tavis Smiley was interviewing Prince, and he commented that when he looks at the credits for some of his songs, he doesn't see any other artist there because Prince wrote the song, he produced the song, he played all the instruments on the song. And Prince's response to Travis Smiley was that I really wanted to find out how far I could go in terms of expression and challenging myself, which is why I did everything, because my music is ultimately an expression of me. Now, if we look at the next part of it, that's the Aquarius. Now, I'm pretty sure that if you're familiar with Prince and his music, a lot of that you see to be the case. He kind of fits the mold of an Aquarius. But the type of Aquarius he is, let's talk some more about that. So Rahu, what does a Rahu mean? Um, Rahu means it's psychic. So when you have these personality types in the type of astrology that we do, we just don't look at the sign and stop at the sign. So let me give you an example. It would be like if you were to look at the clock and say that it's 8 o'clock, right? And the clock could only give you the hours. Well, if the clock could only give you the hours, it wouldn't be a very effective clock, because if you have to meet someone at a particular time, right, and you have to synchronize yourself to someone else's schedule, let's say you're doing a mission or you have a play that you have to do or whatever it's going to be, just 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, it's too general. So for you to really get the most value of the time, you need minutes, you need seconds. And when you get down to the breaking down time into a quantity of minutes and seconds, then it gives you a more detailed explanation of time, and you have a better way to synchronize. Think of astrology the same way. The major breakdown for the heavens is going to be the signs, and there are 12 of them. But then in the system that I use, there's another breakdown of constellations that are in the heavens as well, that go across the path of the ecliptic, and those are called star lords, and there are 27 of them. So they give you the type of sign that person is. So, for example, Prince is a Rahu Aquarius. Um, just to give you a little more in-depth understanding of what that means, imagine that you go to the Mercedes, you want to buy a Mercedes. Um, what type of Mercedes do you buy? Do you buy a sports Mercedes, which will be a SLK? Do you buy a regular Mercedes, which is like a sedan, which is like an E-Class, right? Or do you buy an M-Class Mercedes, which is like the SUVs? They're all Mercedes, but they're three different Mercedes. I don't think anyone would take their SLK sports car Mercedes and take it off-roading. But you would definitely do that with the Mercedes M-Class that's like the SUV. So within a sign, the same way that there are minutes within hours, there are these other constellations which influence the personality or whatever we're looking at, which are called star lords. And again, that gives us more detail. So now when we look at our system, we have hours and minutes, and then we go even further. There's another breakdown according to the system that we use that are called subs. And again, it's just another way for us to get more detailed insight into that personality. So back to Prince. So sign is Aquarius. The star, the type of Aquarius that he is, to make it simple, is a Rahu. Let's talk about what Rahu does. Rahu is a psychic energy. It's a psychic energy that attracts, right? And it's tied to the moon. So again, it doesn't have its own quality. It's going to reflect the qualities of some other sign or planet. So it's this psychic energy. And what happens with the Rahu people is that they tend to be able to pick up on things. They psychically pick up on things. They're able to feel things, feel people, feel places. And these all influence their personality because they're in this constant receptive mode. It's very interesting. Like someone with a Aquarius Rahu has the capability to pick up on what people are feeling, right? The Aquarius would be the people, it would be the masses, it would be groups that they're working in. Rahu is that capability to psychically pick up on what that group is feeling. Now, what makes this really, really interesting is that when we look at the agent that works for the Rahu for Prince, it's going to be, no matter how you look at it, it's Libra or Venus, so it's Venusian. So if you look at what Prince was able to psychically pick up from people, he would pick up on their feelings, how people treated other people. He would pick up on love, right? How he would pick up on happiness, what makes people joyful, what makes people happy. He is going to not only be able to pick those things up, but when you look at that Aquarius, again, that Aquarius is expressive. So he'll pick it up, but then he's going to take it and he's going to re-express it. And re-express it as what? He's going to re-express it as movies. He's going to re-express it as music. He's going to re-express it as some type of art. And why is that? Because Venus governs music. Venus governs art. Venus governs relationships. Venus governs, in many ways, she governs the sensual nature of people. And one of the things that you saw Prince do was that he was very sensual, right? He had that very almost feminine vibe to him. And that had a lot to do with the fact that we see that Venus there, and that Venus that comes to the Rahu. Now, the other interesting thing that comes into place here is that he has a sub. And again, if we were to look at this, we go down to seconds, which is Jupiter. And what I've found from examining people's personalities is that this actually plays a role. So if we think about what Jupiter does, think about the Aquarius, what I talked about, how it works, how it's kind of revolutionary. They're able to speak well, articulate well, express well, do well with groups of people, but then like to be isolated. So they have this great social thing, but then like to be isolated and recharge. Prince. Then I talked about the fact that there's this psychic type of Venusian thing that gives him the capability to express in different types of art forms, and makes him very sensitive, makes him very into people, love, feelings, emotion, how things look, how things feel, that whole sensual piece, Prince, right? And then think of the last piece was the Jupiter, which is the sub on it. Man, that's mind blowing, because what it does is that Jupiter kind of like, it gives a icing to his personality. And that icing, we see the personality. Jupiter is big, so everything that Jupiter does is big. Jupiter talks about fairness, it talks about laws, it talks about what's right. And if you look at Prince and you know something about him, there was this huge thing as it related to Prince in terms of fairness, doing things that were good, doing things that were right. He's done so many. I was listening to one of his other interviews with his lawyer, where his lawyer was talking about how Prince would just send money to people and no one would knew they were getting the money. The other thing about Prince, when you look at this Jupiter as it relates to his personality, is that he did things big, right? The Aquarius as an air sign will tend to be very they're not super expansive. They'll focus on what they do, and what they like to do, and do it very well. They'll get mastery in it, or have the potential to get mastery in it, I should say. But that Jupiter on it made him more expansive, which is really, really interesting when you look at Prince. So we have a peek into his personality. I would love to, and again, I will open this up. I'd love to have some commentary. I'd be open to actually doing a live YouTube or live Facebook question and answer, where people who knew about Prince, or people who are well versed about Prince, will be again kind enough to validate if this is spot on or if it's off. I see a lot of it in terms of how he functioned, what I was aware of, but I'm sure this goes much deeper than this. So let's move on to his sun sign. So check this out. His sun happens to be in the sign of Taurus. Now that's interesting, because here we see this big Venusian footprint finally. Now, when I looked at Prince, I always thought of Prince primarily as a Venusian energy. So I always thought Prince, when I looked at his astrology chart, would either be, his moon would be in Libra or his moon would be in Taurus. But I was really astounded. I wasn't really astounded when it was Aquarius. I was like pleasantly surprised because it fits. But then when I saw that the sun sign, his sun was in the sign of Taurus, it made a lot of sense to me. I said, wow. When we look at Taurus, what's Taurus? Taurus is covered by the planet Venus. So when we're talking about Venus, again, we're talking about artists. We're talking about people who create. We're talking about music, right? So again, he has this heavy Venus energy. In fact, one of the strongest Venusian energies in astrology is that Taurus energy. So here it is as his sun sign. Now, the other thing that's interesting about that Taurus is not only is it ruled by Venus, but it's an earth sign. So the earth sign means that it is very cold, dry, which means it's very reserved, very logical, very hardworking. It's about earthing things, making things physically happen, making things manifest. They're about generating money and they're about generating wealth. So when you see the Venus and the creativity coupled with the earth sign, logical, detailed, that hard-working approach, and you unify those two together, you get money. You get a person who works hard to earn money, right? So interestingly enough, he's a Taurus. Now to make this even, and I'll go a little bit more. So if we look at what Prince aspired, and let me go a little bit further. So he's a Taurus. Now, the other thing about Tauruses is that they're very hardworking. They like nice things, nice houses, nice clothes, nice jewelry, but they work hard for all those things. They party hard, right? So they work hard, they party hard. They're into enjoyment. If they believe in something, they believe in it heavily, and you can't move them. So it gives them a certain amount of stubbornness. I would be willing to bet that Prince was a very, very, very focused person. And I would almost say focused to the point of once he was on something, it was difficult to get him off. And the reason why I'm saying that is because Aquarius can be very focused because it has that Saturn there. So whenever you have a Saturn something, it gives a certain amount of stubbornness, right? Anytime you see someone who has a strong Saturnial energy, you get stubbornness there. The Aquarius is a fixed sign, so that's another element that makes some energy stubborn. When we go and we look at the Taurus, interestingly enough, the Taurus component, which is the sun sign, that element, the Taurus, is also very stubborn, and it's also a fixed sign, right? So you have this element of him both in his the moon aspect of his personality, and then complemented within the sun aspect, solar aspect of his personality, where it's, once I'm set on something, and I'm not going to move, and I don't care what you say or what you do. This is the way I'm going to do it, right? In many ways, when I look at Prince, the way he viewed the world and how he was going to do it was how he was going to do it. I never he seems so revolutionary and so unwilling to change that I wonder if we could get commentary from people to really say if he was stubborn or not, because that would be one of his kind of negative traits, if he's going to have one of the negative traits that should express itself with his personality. So back to the Taurus, right? So the type of Taurus that his sun is, his solar, he manifests solarly, is Mars, right? So again, back to another system that I belong to, we would call that Heteru Herakahuti, but you can, from an astrological perspective, we're talking about Taurus sun sign, with Mars asterism, and the sub-planet is Mars. So what does that mean? What happens when you take the hardworking nature of a Taurus and you couple it with Mars? Well, Mars means you execute things, you get stuff done. Mars is about competitiveness, achieving things, overcoming the obstacles that exist in your place, no matter what. So if we look at the Taurus and we combine that Taurus with the Mars, what does it mean? You have this person who does music, but they're doing music to generate money, and they're very entrepreneurial. They're very outgoing. They're risk takers. They're on the edge. They're on the envelope. They're fighting. Listen to this. They're willing to fight to protect what it is that they've created or what it is that they've had. Now, again, I'm not a Prince fan, but one of the biggest things that Prince did later in his life is that at one point he was actually going along with the record company. So I know they gave him a deal. I think it was, I don't know the record company, I can't remember off the top of my head, but they gave him a deal. And then at some particular point, he was like, this is a bad deal. The way you guys are treating me and my music and artists is like slaves, and I'm gonna rebel and fight back against the industry to control my own music. That is phenomenal. That is exactly what a person who has manifested the sun sign with a Taurus Mars would do. They would fight for the right to own their music. One of the things that was interesting about Prince is that you didn't hear a lot of his music on YouTube because he would go and have his people scout YouTube and force them to take down videos because it violated his copyrights for his music. So he was big into making sure that music wasn't paid for, it wasn't pirated, etc. And again, if you think about that, that has this nice tie into his natal personality, because there's a relationship between the Jupiterian energy that's in, I told you the type of his moon sign was Aquarius, Rahu, with the Venus acting for the Rahu, and then there's a Jupiter flavor to it. So that Jupiter fairness, things need to be, shared, need to be right. It gets reinforced by his sun sign, and when we look at it, the Mars on it and the sub Mars on it. So you get that whole, what should be fair and what should be just, and then fighting for what should be fair and what should be just. And I have to honestly say, when I look at Prince later in his life as a musician, I see him as a fighter. In fact, when I think it was maybe a month or a few weeks before he died, again, forgive me, Prince fans, for not being as well versed about Prince as I could be. He actually won his case that he had against the music companies, and he got control of all his masters to his music, which was huge to him. And that was a huge victory for him. So again, it's definite without a shadow of a doubt that we can see that he manifested that sun sign, and that sun sign of the Taurus, Mars, definitely complemented his moon sign. And again, just to repeat it, the moon sign is going to dominate the personality, but as the person begins to get older, the sun sign is going to play more of a role. And then based upon certain things that that person will do, that sun sign will be able to, in some cases, fully manifest. When I look at Prince and his life, I see the full manifestation of that sun sign. And another thing that's very interesting, he has a lot of complements between his moon and his sun. There's a lot of things that complement each other or contrast. So he has a complement between the sun sign and the moon sign, where his moon sign is Saturnial but creative, and it's Saturnial, but it's this creative Saturn from the Aquarius. And then he kind of has something that complements it in many ways in the Taurus. The Taurus is creative, but it's very reserved and earthy, kind of like the Saturnial energy is cold and dry. So there's a complement between his sun sign and his moon sign. And when we even look at his subs, which are the Jupiter and the Mars, those complement each other as well. So very, very interesting in terms of looking at his personality. And I do see this in his personality. And again, if you're more researched and knowledgeable about Prince and you see how this fits, or even how it doesn't fit, let me know. Remember, the chart is only going to be as good as the time and birth we have. So there could be inaccuracies from it because we don't have his exact time of birth. Um, and then in some cases, we could have other inaccuracies that exist to it. Again, the system of astrology isn't something that's 100%. But I want you to think about it this way. It's about the system that I'm using is about 85%. If you were going to go and you were going to gamble at a in Vegas, right? And the odds were 85% in your favor of winning, would you take that bet? I hope you would, because if you bet, what it says is that if you're 85% of the time you're going to win, you're going to walk away from Vegas a very rich person, right? So again, to put the astrology in perspective, and let's put it in perspective. I don't think I did that initially. It's not going to be 100% accurate. It's not going to touch every aspect of Prince. But what we're going to do is we're going to get some good visibilities, and we're going to get some good insights into the type of Prince's personality, the type of talents that he had access to, and the way he thinks, the way he functions, how he processes things, the paths that were easiest for him to take, because that's what astrology talks about, the pathway that is easiest for you to take in many ways. So now let's take a little breather and let's move into the positions of Prince's houses. So there are 12 houses. Each house has something special that it does in relation to the personality. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all 12 houses, talk about the house. I'm also going to talk about the planet, if there's a planet position in that house, and what the impact is on the personality, or what some of the traits that we should see as it relates to the personality. So let's jump in. So his first house, the first house is super important. The first house is called the rising sign. And the first house is super important because it dictates the way that the person looks at the world. So it's kind of like it gives that person their world view. The other reason why the first house is very important is that it talks about that person's physical health. So it talks about their health, their physical body. It gives you insights into the energy that a person is born with, right? I personally believe that that you are consciousness that never ever dies, and that you incarnate over and over again. So you constantly come to Earth. That's my personal belief. But that first house is going to talk about the energy that you're born with, how you're configured from a physical perspective. So let's look at that, right? When we look at that, his first house, the cusp of his first house, is the sign of Libra. Now, isn't that amazing? We talked about his personality a few minutes ago and how his natal personality, or his moon sign, was an Aquarius. It looks like an Aquarius Venus, but it's an Aquarius Nekabet Venus. So we talked about that. So we see the Venusian energy in his moon sign. Then we looked at his sun sign. His sun sign is actually Taurus, which is a sign that's governed by Venus. And then here we're looking at his rising sign, and guess what his rising sign is? His rising sign is Libra. So what does that mean? The way that Prince looked at the world, he looked at the world as a place of beauty. Venus, the Libra, is the creator. She's the very creative Venus, the outgoing Venus, the social Venus. A little bit different to the Taurus. The Taurus is more of the reserved Venus, the hardworking Venus. I represent her as the Taurus as a bull, because that bull plods and gets things done and does all the hard work. But that Libra is represented by balance, scale, social graces. So how did Prince look at the world? Because the Venus, that first house, is how you look at the world. So the way that the Libra would look at the world, they would look at the world as a place that's about relationships. The world is a place where you go and you create. The world is a place where you go and you experience, right? You go and you sensually experience the world. You enjoy the world. The world is a place that should be, because one of the things that Libras have is about fairness, about balance. Now, interesting that this ties directly over the Prince. One of the things that I've always said about Prince, and other people I'm sure have said it and seen it also, is that Prince was effeminate, right? He wasn't a big burly dude with muscles popping out all over the place. He didn't have a very masculine vibe to him, and it's very interesting that in his first house is Libra, because Libra in first could say to you that he's not a very masculine dude, right? That doesn't mean he's not athletic. So I don't want you to get this twisted. It doesn't mean that he's not athletic or he doesn't exercise. That's not what that means. But that Libra in the first house could very well, to me, explain why he was very feminine in the way he came off, very artistic the way he viewed the world, right? So that's no surprise. That's actually a phenomenal thing to see there. I don't know if Prince had any problems health-wise that related to things that were tied to Venus. I would be interested to know if he had any issues as it related to hormonal stuff. I'd be interested if Prince had any issues related to genitalia. These are all the things that relate to Venus. So I'd be interested to kind of see that from a health perspective for him. So let's keep moving right along. So let's look at the second house. So the second house is the house of wealth, right? It talks about how you acquire wealth, what you can do, what you have from your skill sets naturally to attract and retain wealth. So let's take a minute and kind of look at it. So in his second house, he has Scorpio in that second house. So second house with Scorpio being in the second house, that means someone is going to actually be a hard worker when it comes to generating wealth. They're going to, pick up on something. They're going to work hard to get it. They're going to be competitive. They're never going to give up. One of the keynotes of the Scorpios is that they're going to die to the very end. Once they focus on something, they lock in on it, and they're not going to let it go until they achieve what they want to do. They're very passionate. So the keynote that you would look at for Scorpio is passionate. So someone who's passionate about generating wealth. Okay, that's kind of interesting. Or someone who's going to work hard to generate and to make money. So that's very interesting. Now the other sign that's positioned in that second house is Saturn. And Saturn position in that second house is interesting because the Saturn is going to dominate the flavor of that house. It's going to dominate the flavor of that house. And what it's going to do when I say it's going to dominate the flavor of the house is that the sign may be Scorpio there, but the energy that ultimately comes from that house is Saturnial types of energy. Now, I'm kind of surprised by this combination because typically when you see Saturn that falls in a second house, it's going to indicate or impact that person's ability to have wealth. But we know that Prince was someone who was wealthy. We know that it didn't. One second. We know that it didn't detract. We know that it didn't detract from his wealth, so we know it's very wealthy. So you typically, when you look at a Saturn in 2 negatively, it manifests as the person. It has to work very hard for their money and they're poor. But a positive Saturn in 2 means that the person has to work very hard for their money, but when they get their money, they're able to save it and accumulate it, and they're able to grow it. Now, what I've seen or what I've understood from astrology and some of the things that I've seen is that oftentimes the negatives of a Saturn can be offset by a martial energy. And the fact that he has this Saturn Scorpio combination might even help to offset the fact that the Saturn would typically prevent that person from making money. So very interesting. That's surprising for me as an astrologer. I would really have expected in that second house for him to have a Jupiterian energy, a Venusian energy, something that would indicate more wealth. But he must have been a very, very hard worker with that combination to generate his wealth and to keep his wealth. So interesting. So let's move on to the third house. The third house is Sagittarius. So he has the sign of Sagittarius that rules his third house. There are no planets in the third house. Now, what the third house deals with is it deals with communication, right? It deals with siblings. It deals with short trips. It deals with, in many cases, it can deal with vehicles. So when we're looking at this related to him, Sagittarius being in the third means that you have a person who is a good speaker. They're able to say things that resonate and tie to wisdom that are well thought out. That are often, on point or accurate. You also have a person who, when they speak, they have the potential to be a very powerful speaker. Or, interestingly enough, someone who's able to reach a lot to people with what they're saying, their speech, because we're talking about Sagittarius, which is ultimately governed by the planet Jupiter. And Jupiter, whatever it does, is big, it's large, it's expansive, right? So that is something that's pretty significant that he has there. So, good in terms of speech, powerful speech. One of the things that's there is that the third house also ties to him as a singer, right? So when you look at someone who would be a singer, you would look to see partially the third house. And we knew that Prince was a powerful singer. So the fact that Sagittarius is ruler of that third house, and we know he's a fantastic singer, that kind of makes sense. So let's keep going. Let's look at the fourth house for Prince. So the fourth house for Prince is Aquarius. It's ruled by Aquarius. And we talked about Aquarius already because that's where his moon sign, his moon is deposited in. So we talked about how he is an Aquarius. The fourth house is interesting because the fourth house talks about your family. It talks about the relationship that you have with your mom, what it was like you growing up as a child, your childhood. Those are the things that fourth house talks about. It talks about property that you have. And when we look at the fourth house in Aquarius there, the sign of Aquarius being in the fourth house means that I would expect that the relationship that he had in his household wasn't a typical relationship. I would expect a non-typical relationship with mom. So maybe I'm not sure what it was in real life. Maybe it was a relationship where there could have been estrangement because Aquarius is tied to Saturn, and Saturn could mean estrangement. It could have been a relationship where Prince was more of an equal to his mom than the way a child would be. It could have been where Prince played a role in his family that was more significant than what a child typically should play. But Aquarius, as it relates to fourth house, means that it's going to be a non-typical type of household. So for whatever it is, I would say about Prince looking at this, that his household wasn't a regular household. Now, the other thing that's there in the fourth house, which is significant, is the moon and Mars. So again, whenever we see a planet positioned in the house, it dominates that house. It overrides what the sign is there. And the sign kind of flavors it, but the real influence is the planet there. So when we look at the planet that's there, we see the planet of Moon and we see the planet of Mars. We see the planet of the Moon and we see the planet Mars. Excuse me, my phone is ringing. So we say the planet of Moon and we see the planet Mars. So Moon in 4 is one of the best possible positions in an astrological chart for the Moon. And the reason why it's one of the best positions for the Moon in that astrological chart is because the fourth house naturally is controlled by Cancer. So the moon being the fourth house means that he must have had an incredibly strong relationship with his mother, and there must have been very strong relationships with other motherly-like females. So there's a motherly-like women played a great role in his life, in his early life. That's what his chart says. And I'd be interested to see what happened based upon actually going and researching to look at his life. Now, the other thing that's a little disconcerting is that there's Mars in 4. And Mars is not the best place the best position for Mars is not the fourth house because Mars is the entrepreneur, he's the athlete, he is the warrior, right? He's competitive. those are things you typically don't want in a household. In fact, they're antagonistic to the warm, nurturing energy that you have or should have in a household. So I would be willing to bet that there was a lot of fights and arguments that Prince saw in his household. There was a lot of unrest that he saw in his household with that martial energy, because that martial energy just makes for a lot of conflict. I wouldn't, and I forgive. I don't want to dig too deep into his personal energy, but with the Mars and Moon combination, if they're you know if they're not situated correctly, there even could be situations for abuse with that Mars Moon energy. Now, I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just saying what I would typically see with those energy types. Because again, Mars is outgoing, it's aggressive, it can be violent, it's hardworking too. And then the Moon tends to be the mother, receptive, willing. So you could see some, types of things there. Um, Moon in four is good. He's very much someone who is being in his home. When you see someone with a moon in four, that's a person who enjoys being in their home. They enjoy their house. They enjoy their family, right? So that's just something to consider when you're thinking about it. He may have worked from home. I wouldn't be surprised with a Mars and Moon in the fourth house if he worked from home, or if he had a studio in his home and he did a lot of his creative work at home, because that Mars Moon combination, again, it has some negative connotations as it relates to his mom and his family as growing up, but when you look at his home life and what he did, you could see someone who gets a lot of work done from their home with that Mars Moon combination. So let's move on to the fifth house for him. So the fifth house for him is Pisces, right? And there's no planets in that fifth house for him. Now, the fifth house is interesting because the fifth house talks about how you manage others, right? It talks about how you deal with your pleasures, right? So it's kind of interesting. If you look at Prince, with the Pisces there, Pisces is big, it's expansive, it's watery, it's very emotional, very sensual, very psychic energy, right? So you see someone who is very much into, when they look to manage his energies, he wasn't about really managing and controlling his energies. Whatever he felt, he was gonna express it. He was gonna say it. He was gonna do it. When you look at how, in with regards to a Pisces being here, how he managed others, and there are other flavors to this too. So I'm only giving the high level. There's a lot of depth to this, but this would be so long that you wouldn't be able to get to it, because we can look at the fact that there are multiple signs that sit in the house. So, for example, he has part of Pisces in his fifth house, but he also has a little bit of Aries in his fifth house. So majority of it is Pisces though, and that's what I'm looking. I'm looking at the majority in the house. I'm not looking at the fact that it's going to have hints of this other stuff. So anyway, back to that fifth house. So very much into when he managed people. When he managed people with that Pisces, I would imagine he gave people a lot of freedom to create and do things. So very unstructured in terms of how he managed people. And that's not, and they have to couch that with his personality. Now, his personality is not going to let you go willy nilly. The personality, the Moon and Sun are going to dominate, but he would give whoever he's managing a lot of freedom, laws by which to do things to, and then hold them to that and let them see what they do. The next part of the chart that we need to get into is very interesting. It's the sixth house in his chart. And the sixth house in his chart has Aries in that sixth house as a sign. Now, what's interesting about the sixth house is that the sixth house talks about how it talks about how your friends. The sixth house is friends. The sixth house is enemies. The sixth house talks about how you serve others and how others serve you. So what's interesting that we see here with his sixth house is that he has Aries there. So as it relates to how he would serve others, you would see someone who would be a champion for others, right? What's interesting about the sixth house, and was a little shocking for me for Prince, is that he has Venus in his sixth house. And that's kind of significant because the way that he kind of served people, if you look at his life and the way he helped people, it was through his music. He had so many fans who were deeply touched by how his music helped them. So very interesting that he has Venus in that sixth house. I almost, to be honest, expected it to be positioned another place in his astrological chart, but that's where it fits for him. Now he also has K2 that's in the sixth house. Now this is pretty interesting because K2 is the complement of the Rahu energy that I talked about. So whereas the Rahu is that magnetic, attractive psychic energy, the K2 is that outgoing psychic energy. Like it picks up on stuff. It finds stuff. It figures things out. So you can almost think of the K2 as being an electrical type of energy, whereas in contrast to the Rahu, it's a magnetic type of energy. So when you take that K2 and Venus and you put them together, and you look at how he served people, his music almost had an electric effect on people. His music was actually able to touch people on many different levels psychically, right? And I know that sounds kind of wild, but that's what the combination of the Venus and the K2 equal. It's that capability to project a feeling, to project an emotion. But he's doing it in a way, the way he's projecting it with that K2 is that he's doing it with this artistic way of doing it. So the way that he served others was to project to them the artistry that was in his music. That's what helped people. That's how he served people. Interestingly enough, it also should tie to how people served him as well. So I would imagine there were a lot of people around Prince who were very close friends who were females. Interestingly enough, because Venus relates to female. So typically when you see the Venus, it's going to be artist. That's her. It's going to be music. It's going to be art. It's going to be fashion. But in terms of the people you'll see who represent that Venusian energy, you're going to see young women. You're going to see beautiful women. That's who that kind of relates to. Whereas the moon is a feminine mother. The Venus is the young woman, a beautiful woman. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the people who kind of helped him out, and helped him to accomplish things, they did so by giving him musical ideas or inspiring him artistically. That same kind of projection that I talked about before. So the same way he would psychically project, his music had the capability to psychically project and impact people. That's the way a lot of artists must have affected him. That's the way a lot of the women, the beautiful women he was around, he had lots of beautiful women. He was always surrounded by beautiful women, must have affected him as well. So that's some insight into the sixth house. Again, I can only be but so detailed with this because you'd be sitting here listening to this for 2 hours, and I don't think anyone wants to actually listen to this for 2 hours. I'd have to break it up into 2 or 3 to really go in depth. But the goal is to give you a feel of the sidereal astrology system and its accuracy, and how it compares to the Western system, because in the Western system, his positions of his planets, his sign, none of that fits with this, and they explain it completely differently. So I'm hoping that you'll look at what I'm doing and you'll understand and value the efficacy of the particular system that I use for astrology. Now let's move to the seventh house. Now, for the most part, in reviewing Prince's astrology chart and examining his houses, he's mostly had one sign that dominates the house. But it's important for me to say with this seventh house, it's a little bit different. The reason why with the seventh house is that about 7 degrees of the seventh house belong to Aries, but the remainder of the seventh house belongs to Taurus, which is a sign ruled by Venus. So it's kind of interesting that the things that we talked about so far as it relates to the Aries definitely tie into it. But the other thing that we have to consider is that the same way he had uh, this dominant, you know, Aries energy as it related to relationship, and it's not the best thing for relationships because it can be very direct, it can be very cutting, can be competitive. That is balanced out because the bulk of the energy that's sitting in his seventh house is Taurus. Now, why is that beneficial? Because Venus rules the sign of Taurus, and the seventh house naturally or normally, the natural lord of the seventh house is Libra, which is a Venusian sign. So it's more like the Libra's the win-win. I give some, you get some scenario. So when we look at the fact that he has Aries there on the cusp, not a great thing, and the 7 degrees of Aries being in that seventh gives issues with relationships. But then when you see that he has Taurus that makes up the majority of the seventh house, then that changes the complexion of the seventh house. So it's kind of interesting. We see he can be very direct, but with the people who he's friends with or in his relationships, marriage, for example. But then at the same token, the Taurus is the person who will spoil. It's that bull, right? So they're going to work hard for the person that they care about. They're going to spoil them. They're going to give them nice things, nice clothing, nice jewelry. They're going to find out in relationships it's still challenging because there's a certain level of stubbornness with the Taurus, right? The Taurus is not necessarily the win-win personality. A lot of it is the way that they do things, but because the Venus is there, they are open to listening. They're open to logic. They're open to working with things. It's kind of interesting. It still makes the person, as it relates to relationships, very challenging because, again, you have Aries that sits on the cusp of that seven, and then you have this big chunk of you have Taurus that's practically living in seven. So what you have is this person who, again, they're going to be very dominating. The Tauruses tend to be very um, demanding, dominating, almost pushy in terms of what they want and the way they want to get things done. And then and then the other thing with Taurus is they're very patient, right? So it's kind of interesting. He in his relationships he must have had points where he was very direct and very straightforward, etc. But the Taurus is kind of the opposite of the Aries, is that it's very patient. The problem is that there's a lot of patience with the Taurus, but once uh, they have reached the end or their breaking point. So once they've endured what they considered endured something long enough, then they're going to become a bull and a dangerous bull, right? So, from a relationship perspective, Prince wouldn't be the type of person that you'd want to push. um, because he would, at least based on the way his chart is, he's not the person you'd want to push or you'd want to cross, um, because he would take that very personally. Um, Again, the Aries is what gives the flavor for the house and most of the control. So again, relationships dominating, very direct, very honest, very straightforward. But then that's kind of smoothed out to a certain extent by the Taurus in many ways because that heavy Venusian energy cuts the bite that Aries would have if it alone dominated the seventh house, and it doesn't by itself dominate the seventh house. So that Taurus kind of smooths out that seven, and that Venus. You have the stubbornness, you have the need to protect it or to dictate, but it smooths out. It smooths out that Aries that's there. Now the other thing that's important here is that again, as I said before, when we look at a house, We have to look at we have to look to see if there's a planet there, because the planet is the energy that would dominate the house. So we see Mercury here. And as Mercury relates, Mercury talks about the mind. So it talks about thoughts, how you think, your beliefs. Mercury talks about your ability to communicate. So how you communicate your thoughts and feelings to others. Mercury is going to talk about the logic that you have. So beliefs, logic, communication are all things that come up with Mercury. Now, these are critical for a relationship. And because he has the Mercury there, it's actually a strength, or has the potential to be a strength in that relationship, because that's what the dominant thing is. So when he was dealing with partners, he was a good negotiator when you look at Mercury there. Someone who's able to say the right things, know what to say and how to say it and when to say it. Now, when you couple that, it's kind of interesting that Mercury kind of changes. It has this interesting duality due to the fact that the signs that support it, right? Because if you look at the Mercury on top of the Aries, that's going to make you quick in the mouth, right? You're going to say what you think, and it can be cutting, it can be sharp, it can be hurtful, and you don't give a damn. You're going to tell them the way you see it, and they're going to take it any way they're going to take it. But then when you look at the Mercury sitting on the Taurus, it's kind of different. It's going to stop. It's going to think about what it's going to say, why it's going to say it, what the end result is. Remember, whenever you're dealing with that Taurus energy, it's that right brained logic where you're visually seeing how something plays out in your mind. So imagine you're coupling this with someone who is articulating something to a partner or to a lover. They're really going to think about what they're going to say and how they're going to say it and what they want the impact to be. So it's kind of interesting that he has Mercury in 7, because it kind of it has those two components to it. Now, one of the things that's interesting as it relates to the seventh house is you also have to look at business partners. So whenever you're looking at partners, you're looking at this seventh house. So in relation to business partners, a lot of stuff that has to do with partners to do entrepreneurial projects and partnering around what? Taurus, around music, right? Um, Interesting is that a lot of the stuff that deals with a lot of stuff that would govern the success of those partnerships would be negotiation, for as example. So Mercury, lawyers, negotiating, speaking, a lot of negotiations had to take place with partners. Interesting enough is that you'd also have breakouts with partners. And why would you have bad situations with partners? It's interesting. Even though Taurus is the bulk of 7, right, the seventh house, um, Aries still governs that seventh house. So it talks about these situations that initially start off really good, but then they can turn really nasty really quickly because someone has violated a rule or a law or a discussion or a belief or whatever that is to the situation. So it can go quickly from it's a nice situation to it's a bad situation. The mercurial energy should be able to in many ways smooth it out, but because that Aries is there, it definitely plays a role. So good relationships can go bad as a result of that Aries sitting there. And again, the Aries is direct, it's aggressive, it's not necessarily the best energy for relationships, but again, he didn't have all of that in his relationship. It just probably showed itself at critical times. The majority of what sits in that seventh house for him is Taurus, and that's a pretty good sign for relationships, as it's caring, it's Venusian, it's give get, not as win-win as the Libra is. So the Libra in 7 is perfect because that's win-win, fair, just, airy, communicative, but it's enough of that win-win where it cuts the edge. It takes the rough edge off that Aries that's in his 7. And then again, you have Mercury that's there as well. So in terms of the big thing that hit his relationships off and his businesses off was negotiations, how he spoke, you know, um, legal representation. Those are things that were there. It's kind of, I remember his seeing a interview with his wife. It's the woman who's now she's now married to, I think he's another a famous musician. But she just had wonderful things to say about Prince for the most part as it related to relationships. And then I kind of contrast that to he had two guitarists who played with him on the Raspberry Beret. And I cannot think of these two guitarists, but they were actually suing Prince because they said Prince never paid them um, for the work that they did, right? And that's kind of interesting because you can see where that seven, that seventh house kind of plays out, where you have that, that Aries Taurus piece going on there, right? And then a Mercury thing, so it didn't work out. It ended up ensuing. And then, I to be quite honest, I would actually believe that he would not, or he'd have challenges in sometimes paying people. And the reason why I would believe that he'd have challenges paying people that he would work with is pretty much because of his Saturn, the Saturn being in the second house and Scorpio being in the second house. So that Saturn in the second house makes you hold on to your money, right? Um, makes you very conscientious about what you do with your money and where you spend it and how you spend it, and who's going to get it and when. So not surprised at all that that's something that had popped up, at least within his life. So let's move on to the eighth house. So the eighth house talks about your transformation house. It is also in many ways your the things that you do in private. It relates to the a person's sexuality. It's one of the indicators of it. So when we look at that eighth house, and let's just progress on, we have Taurus that's in the eighth house, right? So it's no doubt that that Prince was a very sexual artist, right? And the interesting thing about it is that he is a very sexual artist, but he wasn't with in this eight, is that way I look at it with the sun there. He wasn't he was the dominant one, right? So with eight, and as it relates to Taurus, the things that he had to work through, he had to transform through, was things that was it related to his craft, him doing his work as it relates to art, as it relates to music. So those were things that he was constantly, fighting with and working with, and trying to improve, because eight is the challenges you face and how you have to transform yourself. Um, the sun, which is kind of interesting, is interesting because it talks about the one of the ways that you transform yourself. And again, remember, the planet dominates that sign. One of the ways that you transform yourself is through your will. So whenever you see someone who has sun in eight, it's a person who, they make changes because they make a decision. Hey, it's a time to change. And once they make that decision, they will push it through and force that change through. Now, the good thing about the sun in Taurus, the sun being in eight and Taurus being in eight, is they kind of complement each other. Um, and when sun is in Taurus, actually, the complement there is that the the capability to do what you will needs support. And one of the supports for the capability to do what you need to do what you will, is the capability to visualize, right? So you had a person in Prince, is that when he ran into problems or troubles, he would, one of the what it says in this chart is he would really sit down and logically, visually walk through how he was going to solve that problem, how he was going to attack that problem, and what he needed to do with himself to change it in order to be successful. Now, one of the wild things that, and I'd be interested again if you're a Prince fan and you know about Prince very well and you can give me some feedback on it, is that the sun in eight usually makes people doubt themselves. So I always think of Prince as a very talented, confident musician, but with the sun being in eight, sometimes that eighth house, because it's this transformation house, it's this house where you have to kind of, it's where you're kind of growing in from your person to your spiritual self. So it's this rough, kind of like when you go through rough times, what do you fall back on? What do you deal with? I'm sure at some point in his life he had challenges with confidence. So even as a artist with that Sun in 8, he probably had issues at some points with, um, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had issues with confidence at certain points. At some point, definitely, he did have an issue with confidence, which he ultimately, overcame to be the entertainer and performer he was. But that Sun in 8 will affect someone's confidence and can actually affect negatively the capability for you to carry out what you want to do. But again, the fact that the sun is in the sign of Taurus really bolsters the sun's capability to achieve whatever he wills, because he's able to visualize it. And again, that Taurus, that logical, right brain approach to visualizing and walking through, the way he would go and conquer his challenges was to visualize, how he was going to do something, and then, go do it. So let's move on to the ninth house. Ninth house is a very interesting house. It talks about how you learn. So do you go to, are you religious? Do you do long distance travel? It talks about higher education. It talks about spiritual teachings. Those are the things that we see relate to 9. It talks about cars, right? Nice cars, different things like that are related to 9. Education too as well. So 3 and 9 are the education houses, but 9 is the higher stuff. So Gemini and 9 means that we may not have known this about Prince, but Gemini is a mercurial energy. It's governed by Mercury, and it means people who pick up things quickly. So it's the capacity of a Gemini to learn things quickly, to be able to rearticulate those things quickly. Also, Gemini and 9 meant Prince would do a lot of traveling. So when you look at 9, it's one of the things that dictates if you're doing long distance travel. And him having Gemini and 9 is definitely the truth. Prince traveled all over the world performing. It's kind of interesting. The 9 also with Gemini there, man, that he had some, he had a lot of what was done was things that he picked up, right? And I would say, kind of picked up at a kind of early age with the Gemini being there. I don't see like a Jupiter in 9, which would indicate that you have a master, a teacher, a lot of things that you had a lot of education. But there's a lot of things that were learned or picked up easily in youth. And I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if he went to college or not. I do know that he traveled the world extensively, and the Gemini directly aligns and relates to that. Now let's go to his 10th house. Your 10th house is kind of like your place in the world. It's tied to your career. It's tied to what you do, how you contribute to, and how you affect the world. And the interesting thing about his 10th house is he doesn't have any planets there. So I actually expected for Venus, for Prince, to be in 10. But interestingly enough, he has Leo in 10. So he has a good chunk of Leo in 10. He has a little piece of Virgo, but it's majority Leo that sits in the 10th house. So what Leo says about 10 is that you have your what? Your own business. Leo is related to the sun. When you think of the sun, you're talking about someone who is the father, someone who is a manager, someone who's the owner, the leader. So here you have this heavy, entrepreneurial kind of energy that you see from his sun sign. And we talked about how his sun sign was a Taurus, Mars. And then we kind of see like the way he gets his money from the second house is through Scorpio, that hard work and that Saturn, that dedication and discipline. And then here we look at the 10th house for Prince, and we see his 10th house has Leo in it, which means that he is his own boss, right? He must have known from a very early age with Leo in 10 that he wasn't going to fit into a regular 9 to 5 and be able to go, work in corporate America. So that Leo in 10 would push you to very much go have your own business and be in control of your life and not having anyone dictate to you what you were going to do and how you were going to do it. And if you look at his music was so successful that Prince was his own boss, right? He was his own businessman. He did every aspect of music that you can think of, but not just from the performing perspective, but from the management perspective as well. So, not surprised that he has Leo in 10, although I actually expected for that Venus to be in 10. So interesting. Now let's progress on to the 11th house. The 11th house is the sum of good things that comes to you. So you can kind of think of it as a karmic house where it's all the good things that come to you as a result of all the good deeds and past lives and that karmic experience that you've had. So when we look at the 11th house, we see that he has Virgo in that 11th house. So how are things going to come to him? A lot of good things are going to come to him through things that relate to information. So books. It's going to come through technology. It's going to books, technology, through learning things, through reading things. So that's kind of interesting. So a lot of it, for Prince, with that Virgo being in 11, a lot of things came to him that way. A lot of the beneficial things came to him that way. But the other thing that really makes a lot of sense in his chart, and it explains his wealth to me because Prince was very wealthy, is that he has a Jupiter in 11. Now, Jupiter is hot and moist, and it's if you look at the planets, it's the largest planet, so it's considered expansive. It's mostly gas. Symbolically, that represents people who do things on a large scale. So when you look at his life, he had lots of wealth, he had lots of fame. um, all that wealth and fame, when I look at that Jupiter 11, and when you get Jupiter, when you have 11 in Jupiter, it's a perfect combination. It's like a windfall because 11 means you get good stuff because you're what you've done in life and your past lives. And then Jupiter, whenever you see Jupiter, even when it's bad, you still get some good stuff with Jupiter. So Jupiter is a lot of good stuff, right? That comes to you. It's abundance, it's wealth, it's fame. And we could definitely see that when we look at Prince. So we see that I see the Jupiter in his chart being one of the things that launched him into to stardom. He just There were good things that happened. He got the right information. He had the right people to guide him. When you look at Jupiter, you're looking at someone who is a master of something, or people who are masters or knowledgeable about things. So I would say with that Jupiter 11, I wouldn't be surprised if there were people who were knowledgeable about the music business who bumped into Prince and guided him, gave him direction, provided him with information as it relates to that Virgo. In fact, the Jupiter itself is in the sign of Virgo, which is a fantastic position into there because there's a complement between Mercurial energy, which is the logic and the details, and the Jupiterian energy, which is knowing, it's knowledge. It's the knowledge of how to do something. So you have, again, this wonderful combination in his 11th house, which enables someone to execute intellectually. Um, because they have guidance and insight, and they're able to earth that guidance and insight and carry it out. The reason why I say earth it is that the Virgo is a earth sign. So the Virgos are very much about carrying things out, making things happen, taking ideas and translating them into the physical. All right, but with a Jupiter on that, blows that up. So he gets good things from people working for him. Also, the Virgo are people that work for you, right? If you look at how people serve him, they serve him nicely. There may be some hidden stuff they're doing to serve him, but if you look at that 11th house, he has people who are coming to him who are knowledgeable to assist him, and he has people just in general who are coming to him who may be technologists, who may be lawyers, who they may have knowledge of a specific area or craft or thing, and they're going to actually administratively help him. So lots of benefit from there. Interesting enough, Jupiter 11 also ties you to wealthy people, interestingly enough. And now let's finish his chart up. And now let's go to his 12th house and look at his 12th house. Now, let's talk about the 12th house because the 12th house is very interesting. So the 12th house is a karmic house like the 11th house as well. But the 12th house talks about what you need to do to achieve spiritual liberation. And this is really wild And I'll say it's really wild because when we look at his 12th house, the 12th house is very similar to the 8th house. The 8th house talks about what you have to do to personally transform. So when you're going through rough times, what you have to do to personally transform. And his 8th house has Taurus in it. So when it was time for him to go through these personal transformations, he would depend upon that visualization and that Haru and that sun energy to help him go through that transformation, right? Where the sun is linked up into the is linked up into the Taurus energy, so that ability to visualize and then act upon what you visualize. It's kind of interesting. The energy in the 12th is kind of parallel to that energy. So here we see in his 12th house, the 12th house is what you are troubled with, right? It's what you have to work through and what you have to master in this lifetime. Just let me repeat that again. The 12th house is what you have to work through and what you have to master for this time. It's the key to your spiritual evolution, and it's the key to your spiritual development. Now, when we look at the 12th house as it relates to Prince, he has Libra there, which I kind of talked about already. So 12th house, if you look at that as it relates to 12th house, someone who has Libra in 12, one of the challenges that they have is relationships, right? Libra is the sign that deals with relationships. So one of the challenges that he must have had was in how he was going to have relationships. Doesn't make a difference what type of relationships, particularly as it relates to male female, but any types of relationships were there. Friends, relationships, that was an area he really had to work with because Libra is there. Now what makes it more interesting is that he has Rahu, which is deposited on the 12th. And I talked about the Rahu being the magnetic energy, that psychic magnetic energy that attracts. So when we talk about that 12th house with Rahu being there, a lot of what he had to do that dictated how he would develop and grow spiritually had to do with him, learning things about occult traditions. Rahu talks about occult traditions. So, for example, if Prince would have learned Qigong, right? Qigong talks about their breathing and movement exercises that strengthen your Qi. Yoga, right? Yoga is a exercise form that focuses on postures, coordinated breathing, and increases the amount of prana or kundalini and the free flowing of that kundalini within the body. I can go on. There are other things that would do it, but the bottom line is that one of the keys that Prince needed for mastery, for him to spiritually progress, was he needed to get a mastery on that psychic part of himself. He needed to get a mastery on that energy part of himself that attracted things to him. So one of the interesting things is he with the Rahu and Libra combination, he would attract all types of women to him, right? With a Rahu and Libra combination, he would be the Rahu just pulls you to things, right? It's magnetic. It pulls you to things. So what types of things is he pulling on? He's pulling on these Venusian things. And in fact, not only does he get the Venusian energies from Libra itself in 12, but if you go diagonal to this house, which it would be the 6th house, guess what is sitting across from that 6th house? It's the planet Venus. So it's further reinforced by the planet Venus. So he was struggling with, I would have to say that Prince struggled with sexual identity. I would have to say that Prince struggled with relationships, and it was the right balance, so to speak. Because with the 12th house, the way that my teacher, Ron Neframan, explained it to me, he's my spiritual teacher, astrology teacher. The way he explained it to me is that he said, think of the 12th house like an egg. He says if you hold the egg too tightly, you'll break it. So if you go overboard with a thing, it messes you up. So if he goes overboard with that Venusian energy, it messes him up. But if you hold it too lightly, you hold the egg too lightly, you drop the egg and the egg breaks. And it's the same result as if you had crushed it. So you have to learn. Your life is about learning how to hold this egg perfectly, so that you're not exerting too much force to break it with your hand, but then you're not letting it slip out your hand either. And that's the balancing act that you have. And it's very interesting that he has Libra in that 12th house and Rahu there. So it meant that what he was doing with his music was very much a spiritual exercise for him, a balancing exercise for him. Um, and if you'd ask me what I think about it, I would think that his balancing act was very well. Whatever he had to do with the relationships and the music, I don't know if he got it right with the relationships, but I do know he got it right with his art. The way that his music influenced and it touched so many different people. Um, so very, very interesting. Another interesting thing too is that I'll give you guys a little secret. The eighth house talks about your sexual expression, but the 12th house also talks about your sexual expression as well. So the 12th house is what happens in your bedroom, right? So just take a minute to think about how Libra relates to Venus. Libra is the beautiful woman, etc. It relates to sensualness, it relates to pleasures, it relates to artistry, and then takes that and juxtapose it and add on top of it Nekabet. There's psychic things, there's hidden things, there's almost things that are almost taboo. So put those two together and come to your own conclusions about what may have happened in Prince's bedroom. Very passionate, wonderful artist. He, I know Prince has brought a lot of joy to my life. I really love his music. I can sync his music and even his movies with certain major milestones. So it's almost Prince's music has a soundtrack in my personal life. I want to thank my friend Hi Hudley for encouraging me to do this chart for Prince. Was going to do it as soon as he had passed, but just was so much going on in my life that I didn't have an opportunity to get around to doing it. I would love to discuss this chart with anyone who is knowledgeable about Prince to see how accurate it is. Again, this isn't a science that's 100%. You're looking at something that's going to be around 80-85%, which is pretty good. So I always am looking for feedback if there were certain accuracies or inaccuracies whenever you read the chart. I probably could have done a better job reading the chart if I did more research on Prince and his personal life, but those people who are fans of his, you can tell me if this chart was spot on or not. In fact, those of you who are personal friends of his, I would love it if you would get in contact me off the record, and I'd be happy to tell me that if the chart was accurate or not. I find that these charts are incredibly revealing, and in fact, the reason why I did Prince's charts is that one of the services I offer through Life, Luck, Love, Astrology.com is to help people find out what their talents are, how they get in touch with those talents, and then how can they exploit it so it can benefit themselves. All right, peace and blessings. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm welcome to feedback. Thank you.